Honorable members, the prayer. Lord, the God of righteousness and truth, grant to our Queen and her government, to members of the Legislative Assembly, and to all in positions of responsibility, the guidance of your Spirit. May they never lead the province wrongly through love of power, desire to please, or unworthy ideas, but laying aside all private interests and prejudice, keep in mind their responsibility to seek to improve the condition of all. Amen. Honorable members, we will now be led in the singing of our national anthem by the Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism, and the Status of Women. I'd invite you all to participate in the language of your choice. Honorable members, please be seated. Honorable members, we are at the start of routine. I do see the Honorable Government House Leader on his feet, which would be an abnormality, but given the circumstances more broadly, perhaps we'll hear what he has to say.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have two things. First off, I would like to advise the Assembly, pursuant to Standing Order 7-8, that daily routine may continue beyond 3 p.m. In addition to that, I rise to request unanimous consent in order to proceed immediately to hear a message from the Administrator.
I'm sure that there's a
13.2, can you please explain how we are able to go outside of the orders of the day and the daily routine?
Perhaps you might wait until the Speaker addresses you. I'm more than happy to do so. There is a pretty easy solution to this. If the honourable members or any honourable member wouldn't like to provide unanimous consent, that's a way to do that. It's very difficult to get on your feet and say 13.1 when the Speaker had yet spoken and not provided any ruling. And as we all know, 13.1 is the Speaker to clarify a ruling in which he had not yet made. So this does present a bit of a challenge both for the Speaker as well as the Assembly. A request has been asked for unanimous consent. I think we can all agree that the circumstances external to the House are very, very, very strenuous. I think we can also agree that we've seen many other chambers all across Canada finding ways to work together. And so as such, it's very possible for the Government House Leader to be recognized. Now, I'm more than happy to recognize the Opposition House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, just for clarity of the House, as we are moving around orders of the day, although I appreciate your comments around other jurisdictions being able to work together, these motions were not provided to the official opposition. We had no notice of this. We're not aware of what is going on the government side. Therefore, how does this House expect us to work in collaboration to be able to vote unanimously on a motion we haven't even seen or been able to discuss? So if I could please have a point of clarity again, why we are not giving notice so that the opposition can actually see the motion that is in front of us so that we know what's going on.
I believe that the Honourable Government House Leader asked for consent to present the motion, which is waiving notice. If members of the opposition wouldn't like to waive that notice, that's well within their right to do so. and if that's the case, I encourage them to do so. Having said that, a request has been put to the Legislative Assembly floor for unanimous consent to proceed immediately to receive a message from the administrator. I will ask only one question. Is there anyone opposed? If you are, please say aye now. Unanimous consent is granted.
Messages from Her Honor, the Administrator.
The Honourable, the Minister of Finance and the President of Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, I have received certain messages from Her Honor the Administrator, which I now transmit to you.
Honourable members, the Administrator transmits estimates of certain sums required by the government for service of the province for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2021, and recommends the same to the Assembly. Please be seated. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, due to the ongoing emergency response to the COVID-19 pandemic, I wish to table the revised 2020-2021 government estimates.
Introduction of visitors. Introduction of visitors.
Introduction of guests. Ministerial statements. Member statements.
The Honourable Member for Lac St. Anne Parkland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Canada and here in Alberta recently, we've truly found ourselves in unprecedented times with COVID-19. We had serious viruses wreak havoc in the past, such as SARS and H1N1. This virus, however, is a particular problem since it's developed in such a way that no one has immunity to it at this time. That is why the prevention of community spread is so important. The government has taken actions that are following the recommendations of the Chief Medical Officer, who is very capable and a nonpartisan official. With major disruptions to how we've come to live our lives and some people demonstrating the worst, I want to celebrate some of the positive things that we've seen today. Belmont Sobeys in Edmonton, as an example, has given seniors the exclusive opportunity to shop in the mornings to get the things they need without people pushing past them. This is a great move by them to support this vulnerable population, and an example I hope other stores will follow. A volunteer group in Calgary is formed to assist those in need, such as food delivery, shoveling sidewalks, amongst other things. In fact, they have so many people looking to help that they have pulled down their posts recently because too many people were responding, calling to the need. In absence of hockey, the Edmonton Oilers will continue to pay staff at Rogers Place that wouldn't have otherwise been getting paid at this time. This is the Alberta that I know and love, Mr. Speaker. As a province, we may not always agree. Most families don't. But like any great family, we're pulling together, and this is why I know we'll make this through this together. Speaking of hockey, it didn't take long for researchers in Saskatchewan to discover a potential vaccine after the NHL season was suspended. The breakthrough still needs to be run through proper testing before it can move on, but there's still light on the horizon there. Until then, my fellow Albertans, while we work through the difficult time and implement temporary measures, continue showing us your best. Please follow the guidelines from health and government officials and keep yourself and others safe by washing your hands. So stay calm and carry on. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre has a statement.
Mr. Speaker, I want to rise today to first thank our province's excellent healthcare providers for working so hard to slow the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic in our province. This morning, I stood with one such professional, Dr. Darren Markland, a senior intensive care doctor at the Royal Alexandra Hospital here in Edmonton. And he told me in no unclear terms about the chaos that this government is causing in the healthcare system by forcibly ramming through changes to physician compensation. Our frontline healthcare staff are stressed, already working long hours in difficult conditions to keep people safe and slow down the spread of the coronavirus. But on top of spending all of their energy preparing for the pandemic, the government is also forcing them to figure out how they will get paid come April 1st. If our province's family doctors are left struggling to support patients in the face of financial uncertainty, that pressure is going to ripple out and overburden our healthcare system by creating additional and unnecessary pressure in doctors' offices and emergency rooms across the province. Yet, instead of pulling together with our healthcare providers and supporting them in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic, this government thinks that this is the right time to continue fighting with our doctors about pay. Cases are growing day by day. There couldn't be a worse time for this government to inject further chaos into our healthcare system. To deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, doctors need stability, certainty, and support, but instead they're left feeling demoralized by unprecedented chaos caused by a government that has doubled down on standing against them. Our healthcare system is being asked to function at levels like we've never asked it to before. This government needs to reverse course and take the first steps towards rebuilding trust with frontline health care professionals. Premier, Minister, end the uncertainty. Pause the changes, restore the original framework, and free our doctors to focus on doing what they do best, protecting and supporting the health of Albertans.
The honourable member for Brooks, Medicine Hat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Albertans are facing much uncertainty with the COVID-19 outbreak. It went from something happening a world away to affecting how we live our everyday lives in a very short period of time. People have had to cancel their vacations or return home from them earlier than they had expected. Schools are closed and parents are concerned about childcare. From toilet paper to water to beans and soup, we have seen people stockpiling supplies in a panic. Small businesses in Brooks Medicine Hat are worried about how they will stay afloat and care for their workers. Hardworking Albertans are concerned about whether or not they will have a job and be able to pay their mortgage or put food on the table for their families. Naturally, worry affects our mental health and our ability to cope in the face of uncertainty. Many Albertans look to their faith communities for guidance and support in a crisis. With the recommendation that large gatherings be avoided, many are wondering whether or not they can go to their place of worship. Fortunately, we live in a time where we can stay connected without having to leave our homes. This is important now more than ever. For many, feeling secure in our faith will help us cope in these uncertain times. We can practice our faith in other ways than attending services. We can reach out to our communities and offer help, and we can reach out to our communities to ask for help. The beautiful thing that this crisis can teach all of us is that practicing our faith is not only those who belong to our congregation, but also with those outside of the walls of our churches. Love thy neighbor is important now more than ever. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask all Albertans to reach out to their neighbors, even if it's just to chat. In Alberta, urban, remote, or rural, no one is alone, and we are all here for each other. Albertans are resilient, and I know we'll get through this together. Thank you.
The honourable member for Edmonton Highlands Norwood.
When I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, "Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping." To this day, especially in times of disaster, I remember my mother's words, and I am always comforted by realizing that there are still so many helpers, so many caring people in this world. Those aren't my words, of course, but those of Mr. Rogers. This is an uncertain time for all of us. This is a scary time for all of us. And this is a stressful time for all of us. None of us can make these very valid worries disappear, but what makes things a little less uncertain, a little less scary, and a little less stressful is knowing that there are helpers all around us. The grocery store workers coming in early and working long hours and facing endless lineups, they are helpers. The childcare workers offering their supports to families that are scrambling, they are helpers. The teachers, the education workers who came to school this morning only to greet classrooms of empty desks, worried deeply about their students at home, they are helpers. The small business owners going to extraordinary measures to support the public and their staff, they are helpers. The doctors, the nurses, the frontline healthcare workers, all those working unimaginable hours, but all united with the goal of easing this pandemic, they are helpers. Each one of you checking on a neighbor, calling a friend, texting a loved one, offering to run errands. You are helpers. We are a province of helpers. We are a nation of helpers. And as much as it might seem right now that you're hopeless, you're helpless, you aren't alone. And while it might seem that each task is impossible and the burden too large to bear, we will get through this, because we always do. So keep caring for each other, keep looking after each other, keep reaching out to one another, and keep helping. Thank you.
The honourable member for Fort McMurray-Lac-La-Biche.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We truly are living in unprecedented times. In a matter of days, our province has gone from watching a global pandemic to living with sweeping changes in our daily lives. Dozens of Albertans now have contracted COVID-19. Each of these people had to be tested, then had their tests sent and examined, to be contacted with test results, and some of these cases have required hospitalization. At every stage, Alberta's healthcare workers have been an essential piece of our response in these early days. In the coming weeks, our health system will face new burdens in order to match the demands placed on it by our pandemic. All workers in our health system play a critical role in managing this crisis. Frontline workers at assessment centers, nurses answering calls on the HealthLink 811, lab technicians testing samples, doctors working in ICUs, nurses, public health officials, and so many more are all coming together to fight this illness each and every day. As Albertans come together to do our part in stopping the spread of COVID-19, I want to take a moment and commend Alberta's health workers and officials for their rapid response and showing remarkable courage and resiliency. Public health officials have already demonstrated efficiency and innovation to manage challenges in testing. And as a result, our province has been able to test nearly 9,000 samples, showing a capacity to conduct tests beyond those of other North American jurisdictions. On behalf of all of my honourable colleagues here at the Legislative Assembly of Alberta, I would like to sincerely thank all health workers and officials province-wide. We are extremely grateful for your service.
The honourable member for Edmonton Riverview.
Albertans are experiencing a crisis the likes of which many of us have never known before. The COVID-19 pandemic has spread rapidly around the world, and here in Alberta, the last update indicated that 56 people were diagnosed with the illness. We know that it is highly contagious, and measures such as social distancing, cancellation of events, as well as closure of institutions and schools has had a significant impact on our province. Seniors are particularly at risk, as they may have chronic health conditions which, compounded with the virus, may cause serious illness and even death. That is why it is so important precautions are taken to ensure seniors are not exposed to the virus and have the supports they need. The Edmonton Seniors Coordinating Council has put together information for seniors regarding program closures. They also have information regarding resources online. This is helpful, but what if a senior does not have access to the internet or the knowledge to navigate it? How will they learn of the changes? And to those who do know about the closures and cancellations, how will they be supported? As this situation may continue for some time, what provisions will the UCP government make so seniors are supported in their communities? Social isolation is a serious concern for many seniors. We know that 1 in 4 seniors in Edmonton seldom or never have someone they can rely on for help when they need it. This pandemic is making things worse, and more seniors will be isolated. Sadly, this UCP government has brought in a budget that is defunding programs that support seniors that will have severe impacts on addressing the pandemic. Programs such as home visitation ensure isolated seniors have the supports they need. We are learning that even before the pandemic hit, these programs would no longer be available due to the UCP budget. Once these programs are cut, starting them up again will be costly. This is the time for the UCP to invest in seniors programs, not defund them.
honorable members, we are at oral question period, and the leader of Her Majesty's official opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me begin by offering my thanks to the Premier for responding to our calls to ban sick notes and ensure job-protected sick leave for at least 2 weeks. However, on the matter of income support, since your announcement on Friday, our offices have been absolutely overwhelmed with requests for information on how, when, or if this provincial government will provide income replacement. They deserve answers. So will the Premier update Albertans today on what his plan is for providing immediate income support, including when Albertans can expect to receive it?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I believe all members will join in expressing the deepest of concern for those who, in the midst of this multifaceted crisis, have had to stay home in self-isolation or who have lost their employment. And sadly, I think we can expect many challenging announcements about job losses in the weeks to come. That is in part why we've amended the employment code to ensure protection of those who have to stay at home in self-isolation. And we are working with the federal government, as are other provinces, for significant expansion of employment insurance to provide income security to those individuals.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on Friday, the Premier said Alberta would provide income support, not Ottawa. Yeah. According to the Chief Medical Officer of Health, the following people should not go into work for at least 2 weeks. Anyone who's returned from international travel, anyone who has had contact with someone who's tested positive, and anyone who has any flu-like symptoms. That's hundreds of thousands of Albertans, many of whom do not have sick leave, cannot work from home, and are not eligible for employment insurance. Mr. Speaker, the Premier office promised them help. When will they hear from this Premier?
The Premier.
Mr. Speaker, last Friday we announced an order in Council waiving the requirement for 90 days service with an employer to provide for 14 days of unpaid leave for the purpose of self-isolation or quarantine if someone is following the requirements of the Chief Medical Officer, and waiving the requirement for employees to provide a medical note to access leave. We are working with all 10 provincial governments and the Government of Canada on an announcement that we hope will be forthcoming early this week to provide a significant an unprecedented expansion of access to employment insurance benefits, including for the self-employed.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, there are hundreds of thousands of Albertans who can't access EI at all. Now, as of yesterday, at least 100,000 families with young children and toddlers are scrambling to find childcare. This forces them to miss work and lose pay. Today on the radio, all the Minister of Education could say is that this would be their parents' contribution to their kids' safety. For tens of thousands of low-income families where parents have to work, that answer doesn't cut it. Neither does relying on the federal government when this Premier told Albertans on Friday that this province would be stepping up. So to the Premier, what is the plan?
You're here. The Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the plan is for an unprecedented expansion of the employment insurance program to include individuals who have not traditionally been covered, including the self-employed, to ensure that there is at least some income support for those who have to stay at home. And, Mr. Speaker, we await the announcement of the Government of Canada. If there are additional measures that need to be taken by the Government of Alberta, we are studying options and possibilities, but first, we believe this is a national responsibility.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, just 3 weeks ago, this Premier's budget was off by billions. Today, by my calculations, revenues are off by at least $15 billion, if not more. On top of that, even with an extra $500 million that they just announced in their healthcare budget, it will still absolutely fail to keep Albertans safe and healthy in this pandemic. The official opposition is ready to help this government and make a realistic fiscal plan to support the actual needs of Albertans. To the Premier, why will you not withdraw your absurd budget and allow us to work together to support Albertans through this crisis?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, you just heard the only opposition leader in Canada who is seeking to politicize this crisis. Mr. Speaker, the budget before this place includes the single largest investment in healthcare in the history of the province of Alberta, to which we have just added an additional emergency contribution of $500 million to ensure that the resources are there for the COVID-19 response. I would call on the opposition to emulate what oppositions of all partisan stripes are doing across the country, which is to get the budget passed so we can pay for our doctors and nurses in the months to come.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this is the only House that is passing a budget with fundamental cuts to health care, and that is actually trying to jam through a budget that is billions and billions of dollars off. Now, rushing through a budget that is fundamentally inadequate, broken, and dishonest insults every member of this House. We don't need to do this. We can pass interim supply that addresses current demands. We can come back and debate a realistic budget at a better time. To the Premier, why won't you take the time to give Albertans a budget that actually adds up?
Hear, hear.
Yeah.
The Honourable, the Premier.
I have 23 years of experience as a parliamentarian, and I have never seen, at a moment such as this, an opposition party seek to divide people, let alone to mislead them. Mr. Speaker, let alone to create public concern about the availability of health care during an unprecedented public health emergency. In 2019, the budget for health was $48.4 billion. In this budget, it is has gone up, Mr. Speaker, and with the addition, excuse me, of course I was wrong, but $20.4 billion has gone up to $20.6 billion, and now $21.1 billion, with the additional $500 million, unprecedented investments to help face this crisis.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, even with his extra health care money that they talked about today, after population and inflation, we are spending less on health care this year than last. And to be clear, there was no pandemic last year, Mr. Speaker. It is not true that you need to pass this broken budget to authorize spending. What is true is that passing this budget now will allow this government to avoid oversight, transparency, and accountability for the next year. Why, to the Premier, is he forcing this House to engage in a sham debate and jamming through a fake budget when Albertans deserve real answers, real numbers, and real plans?
Hey, hey.
The Premier.
Mr. Speaker, many Albertans will recall during the Wood Buffalo wildfires that the then Leader of the Opposition and opposition parties stood down the partisanship and stood with the then Premier in an expression of solidarity. This government has just added an extraordinary $500 million to our health budget to cope with the greatest public health crisis in over a century in the midst of a massive global economic crisis which is hitting this province particularly hard. If we do not know for how long this legislature will be able to sit for health reasons, we need the budget passed now to take care of these issues.
The Honourable, the member for Edmonton City Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I first want to thank the many frontline healthcare workers working so hard to provide care for Albertans right now, and indeed, this question is for them. This Premier announced more than 5,000 healthcare positions would be lost under his plan, including firing 750 nurses, perhaps ones that are working double shifts right now. It's the most serious public health crisis in decades. Can this Premier tell us how many workers will this $500 million injection save, and how many of those will be fired once they're done working so hard on the front lines of a pandemic?
Mr. Speaker, yet again, an opposition that in the midst of a time of enormous public anxiety is seeking to frighten people on the basis of gross misinformation. Mr. Speaker, the numbers he just cited are a complete fiction. They always were, and he knows that, Mr. Speaker. With the additional $500 million for the COVID-19 response, we anticipate there will be an increased healthcare workforce. And, Mr. Speaker, we would ask the opposition to stop trying to seed division and fear at this critical time.
The Honourable, the member for Edmonton City Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Fear and division have been seeded since this government began its attack on frontline healthcare workers. This Premier broke his election promise to Albertans, wants us to rubber stamp a plan to fire thousands of healthcare workers and create further chaos during a pandemic, and we will not. Meanwhile, he's letting his minister pursue an irresponsible fight with doctors who are giving up ER shifts and struggling to stay on the front lines. They deserve a government that respects them, that values the life-saving care they provide, now more than ever. Will this Premier provide some stability and immediately delay or rescind skin their changes, or when will he start focusing on what matters?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the government of Alberta and those who serve Albertans have been focused on nothing but what matters: public health and safety, as well as the economic crisis that we are facing every hour since this crisis began to unfold. This is the only legislature in Canada where we're hearing language of that nature, which is unfit for a time where Albertans expect us to be united. This government has come forward with an unprecedented measure of an additional $500 million in health care support for our medical workers. We're there for them, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre.
Mr. Speaker, this is the only legislature in Canada where we've seen the government tear up their contract with our frontline doctors on the eve of pandemic and insist on pushing it through during that process. This Premier continues to ask us as the official opposition to trust him to do the right thing once his budget is passed. But I spent all weekend, Mr. Speaker, and the past weeks and again this morning talking to healthcare workers who've had their trust broken, who've been disrespected and left behind by this same government. To the Premier, how can we possibly trust you when you continue to break the trust of so many frontline healthcare workers?
The Premier.
So now we know, Mr. Speaker, that for this opposition, when they see an unprecedented public health crisis, an unprecedented economic crisis, great anxiety and even fear in the broader public, how do they respond? With disruption, with division, with deception. Mr. Speaker, it is unacceptable. This budget before the chamber includes $5.4 billion for physician compensation. That is not a reduction, Mr. Speaker. It is the highest level in Alberta history. Hear, hear.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Glenora has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our NDP official opposition caucus fully supports the cancellation of kindergarten to grade 12 classes as recommended by Dr. Hinshaw. But today, hundreds of thousands of Alberta students are at home and they're under great stress. Students are worried about what the future holds for their education, for their families' financial security, and for their safety. So can the Premier describe what additional mental health resources he's making available to Alberta students and their families, and will the Premier please be specific?
The Honourable, the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, we do recognize these unprecedented and uncharted times that we are in. The safety of our students, teachers and staff are number one for all of us, and we have cancelled classes indefinitely and students are expected to stay home. This decision was made on the advice of the Chief Medical Officer. We respect that decision and we're carrying it through. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Glenora.
We respect the decision too. The question was about mental health support for youth who are feeling extreme anxiety at this time, and the Premier refused to answer. Students are home, but schools remain open at this time. We know teachers have been told that they must continue to work, but we also know that there are many other waged employees who care for our schools and keep them clean. These are people like bus drivers, educational assistants, custodians, and many other employees who are paid by the hour. So will the Premier assure this House that no wage school district employees will lose their income as a result of his cancellation of their classes?
The Honourable Minister of Education is rising.
Mr. Speaker, again, these are unprecedented times, and we are working closely with school authorities to ensure that all of the staff are being looked after. To answer your previous question about the mental health and wellness of our students, we do have the Kids Help Phone, and the line number is 1-800-668-6868.
The Honourable, the Member for Edmonton Glenora.
The answer to the first two questions was both about depleted resources under attack in this current budget, Mr. Speaker. Grade 12 students are entering a critical time in preparing for graduation and applying for post-secondary. The Minister of Education committed to ensuring these students would be able to graduate and will have what they need to pursue higher education. So my question is to the Premier. What specific arrangements is the Premier making to achieve this, and when will students know more?
The Honourable, the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, We are very, very confident that every student who is eligible to graduate from grade 12 will indeed graduate. Diploma exams are essential for post-secondary acceptance will continue. We will be working with post-secondary institutions to ensure that these extraordinary circumstances do not prevent our students from being eligible for admission to post-secondary studies. We are working with post-secondaries, and we will ensure that our students their needs are met. Thank you.
The honourable member for Highwood has a question.
Mr. Speaker, during this time of uncertainty, it is important that we bring clarity to the lives of Albertans. An issue that is as complex as COVID-19 also needs everyone in this House to put partisan differences aside. And given that expediting the process for Budget 2020 is necessary to keep critical government systems operating, to the Minister of Finance, can you comment on your long-term planning with regards to the effects of COVID-19?
The Honourable, the Minister of Finance and the President of Treasury Board.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are jointly working with the federal government to ensure that people are supported during this time, that businesses have access to liquidity and capital. As we emerge from this crisis in the long term, Mr. Speaker, we'll be doubling down to ensure that Alberta has the most competitive business environment possible, so that as our economy moves to recovery mode, that we'll be attracting a disproportionate amount of capital and investment back to Alberta, which will result in a growing and thriving economy once again.
Member for Highwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that in Budget 2020 we established specific support to the most vulnerable and healthcare, and given that we need to continue to provide the necessary funding for these crucial areas, and given that just yesterday the Premier announced an additional $500 million to the healthcare budget, to the Minister of Finance, can you please explain what additional resources will be made to frontline staff?
Minister of Finance.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, we are amending Budget 2020, and we're providing an additional $500 million to the health budget. This additional funding will ensure that we have an adequate complement of frontline health professionals needed, and that they have the tools they need for testing, surveillance, and the treatment of patients as the province works to prevent the spread of COVID-19.
The member.
Given that we are seeing global economic impacts of COVID-19 virus, and given that our Budget 2020 is still committed to delivering the supports that Albertans need during this time of uncertainty, to the Minister of Finance, what does this government see as the long-term overall impact of this global pandemic?
The Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we're in uncharted territory. Our initial priority as a government is to ensure that we can provide timely and appropriate care to all Albertans, and that our health care has the adequate resources so that we can ensure that we're providing timely, responsible health care to Albertans in this time of crisis. In the long term, as we emerge, we will assist our businesses in this province to ensure that we have the most competitive business environment possible that will once again attract investment, grow the economy, and provide opportunities for Albertans.
The member for Lethbridge West.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Small businesses across Alberta are suffering. Many are facing significant cash flow shortages. They're unsure how they're going to be able to stay afloat during the pandemic. Many of these business owners are doing the right thing, and they're sending staff home if they're ill, as per the advice of the Chief Medical Officer. But this puts a big strain on their ability to continue. So to the Minister of Finance, what are you doing to offer paid leave for workers without crushing small business, as you announced on Friday?
The Minister of Finance and the President of Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, I certainly want to acknowledge the member opposite's assertion that Albertans are heading into a challenging time, and that's the case for businesses and for employees. Mr. Speaker, we, as mentioned earlier, are working with our federal government to ensure that we have an enhanced EI program that can be delivered nationally and to Albertans, so that Albertans will be provided for during this time of need.
The member for Lethbridge West.
Given that this budget that we are being asked to pass contains zero measures to support small business, given that this government's answer to the question seems to be waiting for Justin Trudeau in Ottawa, and given that many are or will face eviction as operating costs pile up, and given that thus far there has been deafening silence from this government, Will this government demonstrate that it cares about contractors, sole proprietors, and business owners and protect them from eviction due to cash flow shortages at this time?
Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, this government is working right now on various measures that will be rolled out in the coming days, measures that will improve the liquidity and access to capital for Alberta businesses as they face unprecedented challenges.
Mr. Speaker, given that jurisdictions around the world have already put measures in place to protect small business, will the minister demonstrate that he is listening and that he cares by committing to a plan for loan guarantees, for financial support for paid employee leave, and deferred income tax just for a start? Or are we just waiting for Ottawa?
Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned, our government is working right now to ready an announcement that will be coming within mere days. And it will include measures, Mr. Speaker, that will provide access to capital, ensure liquidity, and ensure that businesses can access that much-needed capital to make timely and good management decisions during this time of crisis.
The member for St. Albert has the call.
If you feel sick, you should stay home. This is the advice of Alberta's Chief Medical Officer, and it's advice Albertans should follow. This is not an option for homeless Albertans. Shelters around Canada and Alberta continue to express alarm about the possibility of an outbreak within their facility. To the Minister, what new tangible steps are you taking to protect both the workers and Albertans using shelter services during this pandemic?
The Honourable, the Minister of Community and Social Services is risen.
Mr. Speaker, as my colleagues have mentioned, these are extraordinary, unprecedented times. And I have been in touch this past weekend with shelter providers to try to get a good understanding of what their emergent needs are and what we can anticipate. I can tell you that my department is working closely with the shelter providers to try to put together plans, and also working very closely with AHS as well.
The Honourable Member for St. Albert.
Given that the drop-in shelter in Calgary has cancelled volunteer shifts and agencies like Boyle Street Community Services are preparing for the possibility of community spread, which will be devastating to the homeless population, and given that, I repeat, homeless Albertans can't stay home, to the Minister, what additional money, equipment, and personnel will you make available to shelters to prevent community spread?
Minister of Community and Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, again, my department is working very closely with Alberta Health and AHS and the Chief Medical Officer, as well as all of the shelter providers, to get a deep understanding of their needs, and plans will be put in place.
Member.
Given the serious concerns among homeless Albertans, shelter workers, and volunteers about the risks they're facing, and given that many are still waiting for answers, and given that your budget cut homeless shelter supports, will the Minister commit to publishing a specific plan for homeless shelters during this pandemic? Now's the time to act, right now, before it gets worse.
The Minister.
Mr. Speaker, obviously we are deeply, deeply concerned about our vulnerable Albertans, including those who are experiencing homelessness, and I can tell you that we're working very hard, day and night. All weekend we were in discussions with the service providers and the emergency shelter providers to make sure that we have plans in place to make sure that they're taken care of. That's our commitment. We will take care of them.
The Honourable Member for Banff-Kananaskis has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The safety and well-being of our students, teachers, and education staff is a high priority for this government. Yesterday, the Premier, the Chief Medical Officer of Health, and the Minister of Education announced the immediate cancellation of classes for K-12 students across the province as a result of the evolving situation around the COVID-19 pandemic. So can the Minister of Education please explain to this House the actions that this government is taking to ensure student, teacher, and education staff safety?
The Honourable Minister of Education is rising.
Thank you. As the member indicated, we have cancelled all K-12 classes immediately. This was not a decision that was made lightly. Mr. Speaker, based on what we've seen over the last couple of days, it has become clear we needed to put more restrictions in place to help slow down the virus and protect public health. This recommendation was made after extensive discussions with school boards and took into consideration the cases of community transmission identified over the weekend.
The honourable member for Banff, Kananaskis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister. Well, given that the student safety is paramount for every student across our province, and given that students were scheduled to be writing provincial achievement tests in the coming weeks, and further given that this indefinite cancellation of classes affects these testing times and schedules, can the Minister please explain the accommodations that are being put in place to ensure these cancellations do not affect student progression?
The Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, we expect every student to receive a final mark and that students will progress to their next grade level. As of this time, provincial achievement tests have been cancelled. We are working with school authorities and education partners to determine the best way to ensure students do not fall behind.
You're here.
Honourable member.
Mr. Speaker, given that it is near the end of the school year, and given that grade 12 students are preparing for diploma exams, which are worth 30% of their final mark, and given that grade 12 students are preparing for and anticipating their graduation at the end of this year, and further given that many of these students hope to attend post-secondary next year, can the Minister please explain how you are accommodating students who are expected to graduate at the end of this year?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you again for the questions. And Mr. Speaker, we are very confident that every student who is eligible to graduate from grade 12 this year will graduate. I can understand the concerns. While PATs are cancelled, and at this point we will be moving forward with diploma exams, that only the ones that are essential for post-secondary acceptance. We will be working with post-secondary institutions to ensure that these extraordinary circumstances do not prevent our students from being eligible for admission to post-secondary studies. Thank you.
The honourable member for Edmonton Riverview has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Seniors are among the most at risk of serious illness or death from the coronavirus, which is why I support the Chief Medical Officer's decision to close long-term care facilities for visitation. Staff, however, will need to take on more care for seniors who can no longer receive support from their families and loved ones. For example, family members often help residents eat and prepare for bed. Will the Minister immediately commit to increasing funding for long-term care centres to support hiring more staff to support seniors?
Here, here. The Honourable Minister of Health has risen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, we did take the recommendation of the Chief Medical Officer of Health regarding that recommendation. It wasn't one that we took lightly. Family members, if they are an essential visitor, are still obviously allowed to continue to see their loved ones in those care facilities. Our request is that the visitors will only be essential visitors, and that if they do attend, that they make sure that they're prepared, that there may be additional measures to be able to protect them and be able to protect the patients in those care facilities when they do go to visit their loved ones there.
The honourable member for Edmonton Riverview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that staff in long-term care facilities are overworked as it is, and given that with the growing pandemic, the pressure on them to care for seniors is increasing, and given that many of these folks are wage staff who can't afford to stay home if they get sick, how will the government make sure that the people caring for our most vulnerable don't have to choose between their own safety, the safety of seniors, and being able to afford their rent?
The Minister of Health.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the safety of our patients and the safety of the care providers in those care facilities are, of course, very important for this government. We're going to continue to work with the employees in those care facilities and all of the care facilities in this province, whether they're an AHS care facility or whether they're one of our independent providers in this province, making sure that both the patients and the employees of those care facilities are going to, that their health is going to be protected throughout our response to this pandemic, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member.
Given that the UCP government eliminated the role of the seniors advocate last year and cut $1.5 million from the advocate's budget, and given that the advocate was supposed to provide a place for seniors to voice their concerns and seek additional support, How can seniors and their families be sure that they have a place to go if their concerns are not being addressed by this government? To the Minister of Seniors and Housing, where exactly do seniors turn? Please be specific.
The Honourable, the Minister of Health.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it ends up that we did not. That's completely a fabrication, that the Seniors Advocate was just moved to the office of the Health Advocate, and so obviously seniors could continue to be able to contact the Seniors Advocate in that office there, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Edmonton West Henday has a question.
Mr. Speaker, many working Albertans across the province are not at work today, either because they are taking the responsible step of self-isolating, their workplace is closed, or they're managing the reality of childcare and school closures. This puts many renters at risk of not making rent at the end of the month. Will the Service Alberta Minister introduce a moratorium on evictions due to late or short rent payments when the renter has been affected by the coronavirus pandemic? Good question.
The Honourable, the Minister of Service Alberta has risen.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for the question. Mr. Speaker, we understand that we're in a very difficult time and that Albertans are facing unprecedented challenges. And certainly for folks who will find themselves out of work or unable to go to work because of self-isolation protocols, that can put families into hardship and make it difficult to pay rent. We're monitoring the situation, and we will provide updates in the time to come. We're going to have to make some decisions on how we're going to respond to this, but at this time we don't have a specific answer on this. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton West Henday.
Well, Mr. Speaker, given that many Albertans who are not able to go into work are facing similar challenges with utility bills, regardless of whether they own or rent their home, and given the shutoff of utilities is a severe hardship and may encourage Albertans to go into work even when they shouldn't, will the Minister introduce a moratorium on utility shutoffs for Albertans whose income has been impacted by the coronavirus pandemic?
The Honourable, the Minister of Service Alberta.
Mr. Speaker, I'll just remind the member opposite of what our Premier spoke about earlier, which is that we're working very hard with the federal government to get clarity on the EI policies that we hope will be expanded by the federal government to assist Albertans who are going through this difficult time. And until we have clarity on what the federal government's role and commitment will be on this, it would be premature for us to make a judgment call as what the member opposite has been asking for.
Honourable Member.
Well, Mr. Speaker, given that these Albertans need supports today and they need them from this provincial government, and given that all Albertans are concerned about continuing access to the basic necessities of shelter, water, power, and food, and given that we have seen acts of profiteering and price gouging in other provinces, what protections will the Minister introduce to protect Albertans from these despicable practices, and how soon will he announce them?
The Minister of Service Alberta.
Mr. Speaker, the most important thing that we can do to protect Albertans in this difficult time is pass this budget to ensure that this government has the resources it requires to provide the services that Albertans need, including healthcare services, including education services, Mr. Speaker. That is what our government is focused on today, and I encourage the members opposite to put their partisan stripes aside and work with us to get this done so that we can deliver the services that Albertans require.
The Honourable Member for Airdrie Cochrane is rising.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Albertans all across this province have been affected by the recent events regarding COVID-19, whether they are infected or self-isolated as a precaution. It has become apparent that income may be substantially impacted due to the unprecedented circumstances we now face. To the Minister of Finance and Treasury Board, how will this government support ordinary Albertans affected by this crisis?
Honourable Minister of Finance and the President of Treasury Board.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The health and well-being of Albertans is this government's primary concern, and that's why we just announced an additional $500 million to the health budget for this upcoming year. And Mr. Speaker, as we've mentioned before, and because it is a national responsibility, we are advocating hard on behalf of Albertans to see substantive changes to the EI program so that that program can adequately provide for Albertans during this difficult time.
The Honourable Member for Airdrie Cochrane.
Thank you, Minister. Given that small businesses are the backbone of our communities, and given these business owners are not only worried about their livelihoods, but also those of their staff, And given I've received messages from concerned business owners about keeping their doors open and staff employed as they face the unenviable decision as to whether or not they should lay off employees, to the Minister of Finance, what sort of options are being explored to assist small and medium-sized businesses?
Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, this government, as has been mentioned before, is working to develop programs that will improve the liquidity and access to capital for small and medium-sized businesses in this province, businesses that will be challenged in upcoming days.
Thank you again, Minister. Given I have concerned constituents who work in non-traditional jobs that may not be entitled to employment insurance if they stop working due to illness, quarantine, or deteriorating economic conditions, could the same minister please explain how we will support these vulnerable people?
The Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And this government recognizes that many Albertans do not qualify for employment insurance. And, Mr. Speaker, that's why we're advocating hard on behalf of Albertans to the federal government to expand the EI program so that it can provide much-needed support to all Albertans during this time of crisis. But, Mr. Speaker, we're also prepared to bring in additional measures to ensure that no Albertans are left behind during this time of economic challenge.
The honourable member for Edmonton Whitemud is risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As stated by my colleagues, the Official Opposition Caucus fully supports the public health measures announced by Dr. Hinshaw yesterday in response to coronavirus. But there appears to be some confusion about which childcare facilities were ordered to close and which can remain open. I understand at least one daycare in Calgary told parents they would be open today while they waited for more information from the government. Can the Minister of Children's Services set out clearly which childcare facilities should be closed and which remain open, and what her plan is to ensure that this has been effectively communicated to operators and to parents?
The Honourable Minister of Children's Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you can appreciate, and this is an excellent question, that we made this decision obviously on the recommendation of the Chief Medical Health Officer, and childcare centres have been relying on the information that they are receiving from Alberta Health Services and the Chief Medical Health Officer over the past week, and since this situation has been progressing. I do understand that there was one centre that had identified some confusion over what they were hearing from the Chief Medical Officer, and then they had reached out to parents with a correction about that before this morning.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Whitemud.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that all K-12 classes are cancelled at the same time that all childcare centres are also closed, and given that we've heard reports that the Alberta government and Alberta Health Services is giving its own employees only a single day to make alternative childcare arrangements at a time when all childcare centres are closed, can the Premier or the Finance Minister tell us what steps are being taken to support government employees trying to find alternative childcare, and has the government taken additional steps to support employees to work from home where possible?
The Honourable the Minister of Finance is rising.
Mr. Speaker, the challenges with COVID-19 are moving very, very quickly. Albertans need to understand that this government realizes the hardship and burdens that this challenge represents. And, Mr. Speaker, we will be making decisions in the upcoming days to ensure that Albertans are cared for during this time of unprecedented challenge.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that there's a lot of Albertans who are really seeking some concrete answers from this government right now, and given that childcare centres across the province are closed indefinitely, and given that these centres are the employers of early childhood educators, what arrangements is the Minister of Children's Services making to ensure that these centres do not go out of business and that childcare professionals receive financial support and paid leave?
The Honourable Minister of Children's Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I think that my comments would echo those of the Finance Minister, that we are waiting for the federal government, as we understand that they are expanding EI benefits for people who wouldn't typically qualify for EI benefits and supports. But, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that as a parent of 2 young children who are in a licensed childcare facility, I understand what parents across the province are going through. I understand the concerns of our frontline workers, and I have a call this afternoon with our operators of childcare centres across the province to ensure that we have their concerns recognized and let them know that we are working on a plan.
Right. Here, here.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Rutherford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the weekend, the Premier told Albertans that he was impressed by the preparations done by Indigenous communities for the coronavirus pandemic following a conference call. But there's been no specific action taken to ensure that Indigenous communities have the financial resources to guarantee the appropriate level of health protection. To the Minister of Indigenous Relations, can you here and now list what specific additional supports and resources you are making available to all of these Indigenous communities?
The Honourable Government House Leader has risen.
Mr. Speaker, as has been said several times today, top priority to work with all Albertans, including Indigenous communities, to be able to go through this crisis together, Mr. Speaker. The government's going to have much to say in the coming days and plans going forward, Mr. Speaker. But the most important thing that this chamber can do to help with that process, that this body right here, the Alberta Legislative Assembly, can do to help with that process, is get the budget approved and passed so we can fully fund all of those initiatives to be able to help everybody across this province, including our Indigenous communities.
Honourable Member for Edmonton Rutherford.
A deep concern, considering this budget is 42% less than our previous NDP budget for the Indigenous communities. Yeah. Given that yesterday the Premier announced an investment of $500 million into healthcare, and given that this House and indeed all Albertans are still waiting for details on what this spending will look like or what it will be spent on, and given that health concerns are being expressed by Indigenous leaders, to the Minister, can you tell this House exactly how much additional health funding is being provided for on-reserve care?
The Honourable, the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I can advise the honourable member that the $500 million is going to go primarily towards testing for all Albertans, including those in our Indigenous communities, for public health surveillance, as well as treatment of patients, including those in our Indigenous communities. And when it comes to our coordination efforts with our Indigenous communities, I can advise the member that in the Emergency Coordination Centre, which is located in Calgary, there is, in the bullpen there in the ECC, an individual there who is actually, his sole job is to coordinate the health response on our Indigenous, in our Indigenous communities with those folks, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member.
So I'm very concerned here that there's no specific money for on-reserve care. Given, Mr. Speaker, that like the Minister and the Premier, I'm impressed by the work being done by the Indigenous communities in preparation for the impact of the coronavirus, and given that the budget proposed by this government includes a significant reduction in funding for Indigenous relations, and given that this government knows the impact the coronavirus will have, and the need to make sure that all levels of government, including Indigenous ones, have every single resource they need to prepare effectively, will the Minister agree to reverse the funding reductions proposed in the Indigenous relations budget so that Indigenous communities can be prepared as possible?
Honourable, the Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are taking several measures to look after our First Nations and Métis communities in Alberta. There was a teleconference this weekend with the Premier and First Nation leaders to discuss logistical and medical plans in place. The Department of Indigenous Relations is in constant contact with the federal government under the direction of Indigenous Services Canada and First Nations and Inuit Health Alberta branch to discuss plans and latest information. And the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and department staff are continually engaging with Alberta First Nations and Métis communities to answer questions and direct where necessary and continue to do so. We will always be here for our First Nations people to look after their...
The Honourable Member for Leduc-Beaumont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Alberta has been consumed by the widespread pandemic of COVID-19, and I have been in communication with constituents about what this government is doing to protect Albertans and what our plan is to combat this pandemic. We have heard questions about the resources necessary to supplement the health system. To the Minister of Health, what are you doing to provide the health system the resources it needs to get through this crisis?
Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I was pleased to secure an additional $500 million to support our COVID-19 response in Alberta. We're ensuring that our public health officials have the resources that they need to respond to keep Albertans safe. As I mentioned earlier, that the funding will go primarily towards testing, public health surveillance, as well as the treatment of patients, and we'll continue to implement additional aggressive measures to stop the spread of COVID-19 as needed.
The Honourable Member for Leduc-Beaumont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the Minister for his answer. Given that there has been a shortage of COVID-19 testing kits globally, and there has been a growing amount of Albertans needing to be tested every day, and given that Albertans have been patiently waiting through an overworked and overloaded 811 system to get advice on testing, to the same Minister, what is the government's plan to help those waiting to be tested for COVID-19 and those who are being overloaded on the other end of the 811 phone calls.
The Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Health Link 811 continues to be a critical part of our response to COVID-19. Just yesterday morning, we added an additional 46 more lines to Health Link South. We've also launched a self-assessment tool on Friday. As of this morning, over 800,000 Albertans have completed that self-assessment, Mr. Speaker. We are also working to add to the tool to allow those taking the assessment to automatically be referred to testing if needed. And Alberta's health system continues to work around the clock to respond to COVID-19.
The member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad to hear from the Minister that it's being taken very seriously. Given that the current spending trends indicate that without serious reform, our health system is unsustainable, and given that some are spreading rumors about a reduction or a small reduction in the positions within AHS, to the same Minister, can you commit today to not laying off any nurses or other frontline staff in the midst of this crisis?
The Honourable Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I can confirm that there will be no layoffs of frontline staff for the foreseeable future. We need additional resources in the health system now more than ever, and I've committed to AHS that they will get any and all resources that they need to fight this pandemic. I've been so tremendously impressed by the dedication of our frontline health workers, and I want to thank the thousands of doctors and nurses and other health professionals who are working around the clock to help identify, to help isolate, and help treat cases of COVID-19.
The Honourable Member for Central Peace Notley.
Mr. Speaker, in recent days, the Government of Alberta, following the advice of the Chief Medical Officer, has recommended that anyone who might have been exposed to COVID-19 self-isolate for 14 days. Additionally, anyone who has returned from international travel has also been asked to self-isolate. This means staying at home and, of course, not going to work. This has affected some of the constituents I serve, and they are concerned. Minister, can you please let Albertans know what job protections are available for those who are required to self-isolate?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government is working to improve outcomes for Albertans directly affected by COVID-19, and this includes removing the requirements to have worked 90 days and establishing a special leave. This change will allow employees to take 14 days of job-protected leave to cover the self-isolation period recommended by Alberta's Chief Medical Officer. Details related to how the leave will occur will be coming in the next few days.
Honourable Member for Central Peace Notley.
Thank you, Minister. Given that some employers require employees to get a note from their doctor in order to take medical leave, and given that we are asking those who might have come in contact with COVID-19 to self-isolate, what is the government doing to ensure Albertans will not put others at risk by leaving their house and also burdening the healthcare system in order to get a note?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chief Medical Officer has advised that Albertans should call HealthLink at 811 or use the online assessment tool rather than visiting a medical facility in order to limit the spread of COVID-19. Because of this recommendation, our government is removing the requirement for an employee to provide a doctor's note if they must self-isolate. We do not want Albertans putting themselves or others at risk. This change will help to contain the spread of the virus and reduce the burden on doctors' offices and other healthcare facilities.
Member.
Thank you, Minister. Given that many Albertans are worried that if they are required to self-isolate, they will not be able to put food on the table for their families, and given that many do not have the option of working from home, can you please tell Albertans what options are available to help them if they are required to self-isolate?
The Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We do understand that this is a stressful time for many Albertans and that we're working as quickly as possible to provide additional information. Again, Albertans will have access to 14 days of job-protected leave to cover the self-isolation period recommended by Alberta's Chief Medical Officer. And this government is working hard to advocate on behalf of Albertans to the federal government for an enhanced and expanded EI program so that all Albertans in this situation will be cared for appropriately.
Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, this government is pledging $500 million more for healthcare, an amount that we are concerned will not be enough. And since I may have a very limited opportunity to ask this minister questions and estimates thanks to this government, I'd like to ask him some now. We know in other countries supplies in our hospitals have been a major issue. Minister, how many ventilators are currently available in our hospitals to assist with the treatment of patients suffering from COVID-19?
The Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, off the top of my head, I cannot answer that question. I can commit to the member that I will get back to him with that answer. But I can say this, that we have committed to AHS, as I've already said earlier today, that any and all resources that they need to be able to respond to COVID-19, those resources will be there. Resources and politics are not going to be at play when we make decisions about responding to COVID-19, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Edmonton City Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, given that we also know that the National Nurses Union is calling for the N95 masks to be provided to all frontline healthcare workers, and given that we know the Premier has written to the Prime Minister requesting tens of thousands of masks, again, we will wait on Ottawa, but given that he has made no public statement about efforts to add masks at the provincial level, to the Minister, how many masks are we short, and what are you doing to address this urgent need?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, AHS has taken great strides to be able to stockpile. We have the benefit of being an integrated health system in this province that makes us the envy, I think, of everywhere in this continent, especially at a time like this. It allowed AHS to be able to respond very rapidly and stockpile. Very happy to be able to provide the member with the exact number of masks and other PPEs that we have at the ECC in Calgary. I did have the chance to go and visit the stockpile at the ECC at that location, and very impressed by the amount of work AHS has done to respond so far.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, given that I hope our healthcare system continues to be an envy, and given that we know that about 96% of acute care beds are currently full, and given that there's been no update of additional beds being added for need that will no doubt come, to the Minister, are you adding any additional beds to Alberta hospitals, and when would those be available?
Minister of Health.
Well, as it happens, Mr. Speaker, AHS has already been working. They started this work actually in January, back when coronavirus was first identified in China. They actually began the work to prepare to be able to expand the ability for us to be able to provide acute care beds for patients in Alberta. Very proud of AHS and the quick ability to be able to respond to this and be able to provide that quick responsive action and expanding the number of beds we can have to respond to COVID-19.
Honourable members, in 30 seconds or less, we will return to member statements.
That's the first thing I would have asked the MDL a week ago. Like, that's crazy.
The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park has a statement to make.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our province is taking aggressive, widespread action to slow the spread of COVID-19 across our province. Public health experts have stated that here in Canada, we are at a critical moment to reduce the severity of the outbreak. The news last week that a child in Calgary had contracted COVID-19 was a sobering moment for families province-wide. No parent wants to imagine their own child seriously ill with this type of virus. I remember my own family growing up just how quickly illness can spread through a household or community once a child is contagious. Public health and school officials have been weighing the risks of gatherings in classrooms and ultimately advised that all in-person classes be cancelled in the province for the foreseeable future. This decision did not come lightly, and it represents the seriousness of the moment in slowing the spread of COVID-19 throughout Alberta. With new cases of community transmission detected over the weekend, it is clear that serious